There's something engaging about reading a primary source. We want to share this feeling. The exhibit has a video monitor that displays research facilities and some documents about slavery. Visitors choose to study all or any of 15 primary documents. We hope that they can help us solve a few mysteries. We're puzzled by the E question. Column 6 of this transcript from the 1860 Census slave schedule is labeled Fugitive from the State. If E means escaped, fully a third of Harpers Ferry slaves had run away. That's a lot of people, and we have no other evidence to support that many runaways. E could also mean employed, but if that's the case, numerous young children were being hired out. Unfortunately, we will probably never know what the E stood for. Most likely the census taker had his own system and died with its secret. Free African Americans also have an important place in the exhibit. Because Harpers Ferry was an industrial town, there were jobs available for free blacks. This gave free African Americans opportunities that slaves did not have. It would be a mistake, though, to imply that they did not face tremendous disadvantages. In Virginia, no free African American could stay in the state for more than a year unless some reputable white person would vouch for their character. Sometimes local free blacks were sold into slavery. We found an 1857 newspaper that announced the sale of several free women at public auction. Even so, because of the local demand for cheap labor, some free blacks were able to settle in. The Spriggs family still resides in Harpers Ferry. They gave us some family photographs dating back to the late 1860s. The Spriggs can trace their ancestry back to Thomas Spriggs. Thomas shows up in Harpers Ferry on the 1820 census. John Butler is a good example of another free African American who was able to overcome some of the disadvantages white society placed upon him. Butler served in the Navy during the War of 1812. When he moved to Harpers Ferry, he worked as a lock keeper for the gun factory. In 1840, Butler was attacked by a bunch of white punks. As a black man, Butler's testimony could not be used in court, but the audio program tells of how Butler was able to manipulate the legal system and get his attackers placed in jail. There were also successful free black businessmen in town. John Gust was a stonemason who held large contracts with the United States Armory. The 1830 census shows that he had several slaves living in his house. If he owned these slaves, they were probably family and friends. In this way, they could be free in a practical sense, while Gust protected them from the anti-free black laws. We know for a fact that free African Americans sometimes did own slaves. One of the best audio stations in the exhibit tells the story of John Douglas. Douglas bought his wife and son for $1,000 in 1855. Even though he owned them, Douglas could not free them. Douglas only had $400. He was forced to use his wife and son as collateral to secure a loan for the $600 he needed to buy them in the first place. When we tell this story on programs, visitors literally gasp. The good news is that Douglas paid the debt and freed his wife and son in 1856 on his wife's birthday. For most of the Civil War, Harpers Ferry was a large federal garrison. We averaged about 10,000 troops stationed here at any given time. The Civil War brought huge changes to Harpers Ferry, and African Americans brought huge changes to the Civil War. At the beginning, the war was not officially about slavery, but thousands of African Americans saw it differently. We have a great audio station that tells the story of Charles Stewart. In February 1862, Harpers Ferry was a no man's land. A Confederate cavalry captain brought his men into town on February 6th. He sent a slave down to the confluence of the Shenandoah and Potomac rivers to lure federal agents into range. As they came across in a boat, shots rang out, and one federal scout was killed. By March, the Union had full control over Harpers Ferry. Charles Stewart was a slave who ran away. Stewart told Union officers in Harpers Ferry that he was owned by the Confederate who organized the February ambush. Stewart said he left his master because he refused to be used against Union troops. Stewart was just one of thousands of African Americans who left slavery and came to town. At first, the United States government decided that runaway slaves were simply contraband of war and put them to work, but there was no turning back. Those African Americans helped force the government to adopt emancipation as a war aim. For the most part, Harpers Ferry was a safe haven for blacks and a place where they could get work. One of the most heart-rending stories of the war, though, took place when Confederate General Stonewall Jackson captured 12,500 Union troops at Harpers Ferry in September 1862. Accounts claim that between 600 and 1,000 African Americans were also captured. The Confederates rounded them up and drove them back into slavery. Still, things were changing. Black men were becoming soldiers. Martin Delany was a prominent black abolitionist before the war and became a major in the Union Army. Delany was born about 8 miles from Harpers Ferry. The 19th United States Colored Troops passed through here on a recruiting mission in 1864. It's worth trying to imagine the reactions of townspeople who had been here in the days of John Brown. Brown had been hanged for giving black men weapons in 1859. In less than 5 years, things had changed a great deal. This exhibit is designed primarily to tell the story of African Americans before and during the Civil War. Right now, the park is planning several other exhibits to tell the bulk of the post-war history. But we don't want to leave the impression that with emancipation the story ended. Toward the end of the war, the government set up the Freedmen's Bureau to help ex-slaves with their transition to freedom. The Freedmen's Bureau had an office in Harpers Ferry. Among other things, they settled disputes, they established courts, and they distributed food to the needy. The Freedmen's Bureau's most lasting contribution in Harpers Ferry was its help in founding Storer College. This school was open for people of all races and both sexes. Most African Americans had been denied the opportunity to read and write before the war. They realized that they needed these skills to capitalize on freedom. Dozens of schools like Storer were established by African Americans and philanthropic groups all over the South. We are including film of Storer, as well as oral histories of Storer alumni to describe the school's ethic of honest labor, religion, education, and property ownership. Storer was an oasis for many African Americans until its closing in 1955. It was a place that helped the struggle for equality and built community. Many African Americans were able to build successful lives after the Civil War. Most blacks, however, still faced tremendous problems. Discrimination was everywhere. Racial violence was all too common. By the end of the 19th century, Jim Crow laws had taken away most of the hopes and promises of emancipation. African Americans fought back. They organized and worked for justice. In 1906, W.E.B. Du Bois and other members of the Niagara movement met at Harpers Ferry. This organization was considered radical in its day. Its members were largely responsible for the founding of the NAACP in 1909. Du Bois made 5 simple demands of white society when he addressed the convention. He asked for the vote, an end to discrimination and public accommodations, the right for blacks and whites to interact socially, equal application of the law, and the opportunity for equal education. Before they left Harpers Ferry, the members of the Niagara movement recognized the historic importance of the town. They visited the site of John Brown's fort. Visitors can listen to the words of Benjamin Quarles, a noted historian, as he describes the men taking off their shoes as they approached what to them was a holy symbol. Harpers Ferry remains a place for inspiration. It is a place to learn lessons from the past. At Harpers Ferry National Historical Park, we preserve the important role of African Americans in national history. We realize the importance of that history to the concerns of today. With this exhibit, Black Voices from Harpers Ferry, we present the experiences of local African Americans in a national context. We focus on people and their struggle. We try to challenge stereotypes. We try to educate. And we try to provoke a deeper understanding of the contributions of African Americans. Isaac Gilbert is long gone, but his efforts to free his family and his ability to cope within an oppressive system are now on display. Hopefully, Isaac Gilbert's life can have some impact on the future.